The world says it wants peace in Gaza. I mean, we hear it constantly, the calls for stability and end to the suffering. But there's a truth in the source material you provided that's pretty hard to ignore.
What's that?
Peace always has a price. And when that price involves control, the question becomes, who decided? Who pays it?
And that question, that's the absolute core of the firestorm around UN Security Council Resolution 2803. We're doing a deep dive today into the documents that call this the most consequential and, well, probably the most controversial decision of the last year.
Welcome to the deep dive. So this resolution, it's often sold as this, blueprint for stability in Gaza.
Right.
But it's facing just relentless scrutiny. Some sources say it's necessary. A powerful counter-narrative, though, frames it as something else entirely, not a peace plan, but a mechanism of control.
It's being called a new form of international trusteeship, and that's a loaded term. Critics are basically saying it's a colonial model at its core, just wrapped in humanitarian language to make it go down easier.
So our mission today is to unpack that for you. We're going to get into the nuts and bolts of 2803, look at the, frankly, damning historical parallels people are drawing, and dissect the geopolitical leverage points.
Yeah, from Germany's arms policy all the way to Saudi Arabia's trillion-dollar carrot. We need to ask, is this plan a pragmatic necessity, or is it, an old power structure just getting a new coat of paint?
Okay, so let's start with what 2803 actually created on the ground.
Operationally, it's two big things. First, something called a Board of Peace.
And second, it authorized an international stabilization force, the ISF.
Exactly. And the supporters, the sort of realist camp, they argue this was just unavoidable. When governance completely collapses in a war, a power vacuum is the most dangerous thing there is.
So you need someone to step in.
You need external oversight to stop the violence from escalating. The stabilization force is there to fill that vacuum.
But the critics say, wait a second, look at what this Board of Peace is actually allowed to do. Because it's not just an advisory group, is it?
Oh, not at all. It's tasked with overseeing core government functions. We're talking judicial reform, tax collection, managing the border crossings.
That's running a country.
It is. And that's why critics immediately slap the label administration without consent on it. They point out this whole thing was drafted and approved by outsiders. The actual Palestinians weren't at the table to consent to their own governance.
The counter to that, of course, is that in a crisis, you can't always wait for consensus. You have to stabilize things first. Then you can have the political conversation.
But that's the whole debate, isn't it? The critics see that instability not as the reason for intervention, but as the pretext for it.
It raises that question for you, the listener. When does support become control?
And that's where the history lesson comes in. This is where it gets really uncomfortable.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Scholars are directly linking the language of 2803 to old trusteeship models. Think back to the early 20th century. That was a logic used to justify colonial administration.
Defining a place as needing. What, guardianship?
Guardianship until they were ready for self-rule.
Yes.
And the sources we've seen break down this playbook, it's worryingly familiar.
So what are the steps?
Step 1, define a population as, not ready for self-governance because of chaos. Step 2, install external guardians, in this case the board and the ISF.
And step 3.
Use the noble goal of peace to justify the immediate non-consensual control. The logic treats the people like wards needing supervision, not partners.
And this leads to the most serious charge of all.
It does, that the model is inherently racialized.
Now, let's slow down on that because the defense is that this is a neutral mechanism. It applies to any failing state.
Right, that's the stated intent, yes. But the critics say intent doesn't matter if the impact is always the same. The argument is that the model assumes some peoples are, naturally capable of governing, while others seem to always need supervision.
An adult-child dynamic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when that pattern keeps getting applied to the same non-Western populations, the structure itself, regardless of good intentions, starts to look a lot like old hierarchies making a comeback under a new name.
It's a really powerful critique. And while we're talking about these huge structures, we can't forget the people on the ground.
So important. We're talking about displaced, traumatized, hungry civilians who have basically zero political agency right now. Foreigners are deciding their future.
And the argument there is pretty devastating. Help without representation is just paternalism.
It frames people as recipients, not partners. And this whole thing was legally locked in just after the vote. We have to talk about the November 18th shift.
Right, the resolution passes, but then the next day, a bunch of states issue this unified interpretation of it.
And that interpretation was everything. It gave the ISF its legal enforcement role, it made the whole roadmap binding, and critically, it said non-cooperation from any party could trigger UN action.
It gave the resolution teeth.
Serious teeth. But that's what led to what our sources call the perfect collision.
How so?
Well, the ISF was now empowered to oversee demilitarization, but Hamas immediately rejected it. They said that erases their right to resist.
So you have a force meant to disarm and a group that refuses to be disarmed.
An immediate structural impasse. And then, as if that wasn't enough tension, the news breaks that Tony Blair is joining the peace team.
Which did not go over well with critics.
The trust deficit was, instantaneous. His record in Iraq, his perceived alignment with U.S. policy, he's seen as a symbol of the old order, not a fresh start.
Though the argument for him is that he has experience in these complex negotiations.
But the critics would say he carries structural bias, not neutrality. Which brings us to the architects of this whole thing. How can the U.S. and Israel, who are central to the conflict, also be the ones shaping the peace?
It's influence disguised as arbitration, right?
That's the charge. And it's made worse by the actual rhetoric. Resolution 2803 keeps talking about political horizons, which implies, a state down the line.
But at the same time, Israel's prime minister has been on record repeatedly saying, no two states, not now. Not ever.
That is the massive cognitive dissonance. How can your peace plan promise a future that one of the main parties completely rejects? It makes the UN framework seem, delusional.
Or like it's just meant to manage the conflict, not actually solve it.
Precisely. And you even saw this contradiction play out with key allies, like Germany.
With the arms freeze.
Exactly. Germany had put a freeze on arms exports to Israel. Around the time of the resolution, they lifted it. Resumed exports.
So critics jump on that and say, look, strategic alignment is more important than the humanitarian message.
It signals a hierarchy of concern, is how they frame it. The security of one party is prioritized over the supposed stabilization goals of the UN plan.
Let's zoom out a bit to the bigger geopolitical game. We have to talk about Saudi Arabia, the trillion-dollar package.
That's the biggest chip on the table. The Crown Prince, MBS, has been crystal clear with Washington. Normalization and that huge investment package are conditional on a guaranteed, credible path to a two-state solution.
And this isn't just pocket change. This is foundational money for their huge projects. It affects global markets.
So what you have is this power triangle in complete denial. Saudi Arabia demands a two-state path.
Israel rejects it.
The U.S. and the UN framework just sort of pretend that all these things can exist at the same time. Critics call it geopolitics in a state of suspended reality.
And one of the biggest structural flaws people point to is who wasn't in the room when this was designed.
Yeah. Key regional players, Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, were basically sidelined.
States with massive influence. Qatar with money and mediation, Egypt with the Rafah border.
The argument is simple. Geography can't be outsourced. You can't build a durable peace by alienating the neighbors who have to live with it.
And what about the other big powers? China, Russia, they abstained.
And that abstention is seen as signaling deep disbelief. It was a plan they would tolerate maybe, but not one they were going to bet on.
The paradoxes seem to be baked right into the plan itself, like reconstruction aid.
The aid is conditional, supposedly for accountability, but critics just see that as structural leverage. It means rebuilding your home is tied to an external political control mechanism.
And then there's the core philosophy of the whole thing, the security first doctrine.
Right. The idea that you stabilize first with the ISF and then you talk politics later.
Has that ever worked?
The sources say it's failed almost every way it's been tried. What happens is the temporary stabilization force becomes a permanent occupation and the political conversation just gets delayed forever.
Which brings us right back to the central problem of legitimacy.
Absolutely. Critics say you cannot impose legitimacy from the top down, not on a population that has been through this much trauma. A structure that bypasses consent is, well, it's set up to fail.
So we circle back. Resolution 2803 came from, you could argue, a legitimate goal, stability and the crisis. But the method governance without consent, it just opens up all these ethical and political wounds about paternalism, about history repeating itself.
That's the conflict right there. A realist looks at this and sees a necessary strategy for a war zone. A critic looks at the same plan and sees injustice, a power play disguised as help.
And the final analysis seems pretty sobering. The powerful who wrote the rules get to keep control and define the future.
Yes. Critics would argue the winners are the architects and the losers are the people living the reality in Gaza. The lasting damage might not just be from the war, but from a governance structure that was designed for them, but never, ever with them. And you really have to consider, can stability that's achieved through that kind of control ever really be called peace?